Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, the third in our series on the return of CHPS criteria for use in Massachusetts. Today we have a number of presenters. The first is myself, the CHPS Technical Director, Stephanie Mason, and the other two presenters are from James Carr Architecture and Design. You'll be hearing from James Carr, the Principal Architect, and Lisa Purdy, the Sustainability Coordinator at James Carr. They are currently working on the first Northeast CHPS project in Massachusetts since the return of CHPS. Hold on, I just want to make sure people can hear me. All right. So I believe James and Lisa are now with us, and I will be handing over the presentation to them in a little while. So our agenda for today, myself representing CHPS will briefly go over the history of CHPS in Massachusetts, and then we'll follow up with a discussion of the differences between the previous version of CHPS that for use in Massachusetts, the 2009 version of Massachusetts CHPS, as compared to the new Northeast CHPS criteria of version 3. Afterwards, I will hand the presentation off to James Carr and Lisa Purdy, and having worked on this first project in Massachusetts with the Northeast CHPS criteria and the new process, they'll go over some aspects of working with CHPS, some of the sustainable design challenges they've run into, and some of the best practices that they've determined as a result. And finally, we'll wrap up with some time for some Q&A. Okay, so CHPS has a fairly long history in Massachusetts. Starting back in 2004, NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Program, and if I got it wrong, I'll give you the name in a second. They licensed the CHPS Best Practices Manual back in 2004, and then in 2006, they developed their own version of the CHPS criteria, Massachusetts CHPS in 2006. Since then, there was one other version in 2009. There was an updated second edition of Massachusetts CHPS criteria. So with those two versions of CHPS, there were over 70 schools have been completed. So there are over 70 CHPS schools in Massachusetts today, and about a quarter of those are verified leader projects. So they were eligible for the MSBA additional reimbursement. So in 2015, there was a change from using Massachusetts CHPS to using Northeast CHPS in Massachusetts. And so why was this? The Massachusetts CHPS criteria was due for an update to align with version 2 of the CHPS core criteria, and also, and more importantly, to incorporate the more recent versions of the Energy Code, IECC 2012 or ASHRAE 90.1 2010. Version 3 of Northeast CHPS criteria had already gone through this process, and many members of the Massachusetts CHPS Partner Advisory Committee were also on the Northeast CHPS Committee. Additionally, the priorities emphasized in the Northeast CHPS were consistent with those for Massachusetts, and they'll show MSBA agreed to accept Northeast CHPS as a pathway for their Green Schools program. Moving to the Northeast CHPS was a faster and more cost-effective pathway for achieving an updated CHPS criteria for use in Massachusetts. So that's sort of the history of how we went from Massachusetts CHPS criteria to the Northeast CHPS criteria. A little bit about NEEP. NEEP is one of 6 regional energy efficiency organizations in the U.S. So their mission is really designed around accelerating energy efficiency, and we have partnered with them. They have partnered with CHPS because they're focused on energy efficiency in addition to sustainability in schools specifically. So that's where we overlap. And you can see their region encompasses all of the Northeast, and Massachusetts is within the NEEP region. So that's why there is an overlap in the committees. A little bit about Northeast CHPS itself. The background, there was a regional working group established in 2004, so about the time that Massachusetts CHPS, Massachusetts adopted the license to best practices, Northeast CHPS created a regional working group. And then they licensed CHPS in 2006 to develop their own version in 2007. Again, it was adapted for the unique climate, educational priorities, and energy codes similar to those in Massachusetts, and vetted through stakeholders. Version 3 was released in 2014, and there are a couple of supporting resources for use with this. The Companion Operations and Metrics Guide, which you can access on the NEEP website, as well as exemplars. There's an example one here. Details some of the schools that have used the CHPS criteria with highlights of the details, and it's a way to look at specific features that they want to highlight. And this is something that, if you're interested in, NEEP can help facilitate, as well as CHPS. A little more about the MSBA Green Schools program. In April 2015, the MSB updated their Sustainable Building Design Policy to accept Northeast CHPS V3, and then effective July 29th, so for about a year now, MSBA projects could use either the latest version of CHPS or LEED. So just for comparison, for the 2 reimbursement levels, this is for LEED V4 as compared to Northeast CHPS V3. Just as a reminder, for no additional reimbursement, the energy requirement is 10% above code, and both LEED V4 and Northeast CHPS V3 are based on IECC 2012 or ASHRAE 90.1 2010. You can see that for both levels of reimbursement, the verified level of CHPS recognition is sufficient. There's no requirement to be verified leader for the additional reimbursement as there had been in the past. And this is because the Northeast CHPS criteria go above and beyond the former Massachusetts CHPS. So they've advanced with the times. And so the Northeast CHPS verified is now comparable to LEED V4, or considered to be LEED V4 Silver. The other thing to note is that for the Northeast CHPS, there's no additional requirement. There's no specified credits that need to be met. There are 6 points that have been allocated for the prerequisite in energy performance, and that's all that's required. However, for LEED, there is additional energy points that need to be obtained in the energy credit. And then for the 2% additional reimbursement, both for LEED and CHPS, there are additional points that need to be pursued in the energy credits for superior or optimized energy performance. I just want to go over a few of the the differences between the CHPS and LEED rating programs, and why there are two different options. They're not exactly the same. They're both building rating systems, but they have slightly different emphasis. So on the first thing you can see from this slide is that the two categories of criteria that CHPS emphasizes the most are energy and indoor environmental quality. The indoor environmental quality being that bright blue, energy being the red. Yeah, hopefully nobody's colorblind. Whereas for LEED, energy is one of the top categories, but the second most category with most points is a combination of the locations and sites. That's in CHPS, there's only sustainable sites. So the location, transportation, sustainable sites, and energy and LEED, and energy and IEQ. And that gets to the fact that CHPS is really focused on the indoor environment and the well-being of the students and staff, trying to create an optimal environment for learning and performance. So CHPS specifically addresses K through 12 facilities. That's all we look at, whereas LEED looks at the other buildings. Like I said, in Northeast CHPS, the IEQ category comprises approximately 30% of the points, followed by energy at about 27%. With LEED, energy is also 28%, but IEQ is only 15%, so slightly different emphasis. The other thing is that CHPS criteria includes operations and metrics as a category within the criteria. It's not a standalone system. So we are looking to confirm the performance that we're designing for. The other difference is CHPS has flexibility built into it to account for climate and other local conditions and regional priorities. About 20% of the points are regional. CHPS can also be used for both new construction and for renovations. And for the renovations, there's reduced point requirements. It's on the earlier slide. And finally, one of the other differences, CHPS is a small organization, and we try and provide, a lot of personalized service. Whereas LEED is a large organization, but they have a lot more online resources. So we're just two different organizations. A couple of other differences, credit differences, regarding the indoor environmental quality. In the CHPS criteria, both low-emitting materials and glare protection are prerequisites, and the acoustic and IAQ performance prerequisites are more comprehensive than in LEED v4. Another point to note is that CHPS is designed towards ZNE. There's really an emphasis on getting towards zero energy or zero net energy, with points available down to ZNE. If you go completely ZNE, there's points available, and there's also ZNE ready and ZNE bonus credits. And finally, there are some additional credits, which we'll get into later, that CHPS has credits for things like educational integration, crime prevention through environmental design, phase renovations, training. A lot of these credits are designed specifically for schools itself. The Northeast CHPS point summary, there's been a change in the point structure if you're familiar with the old CHPS program. Now all criteria, including prerequisites, have points, and there are a total of 250 points. As I mentioned earlier, 20% are regional, so 200 points were assigned in the core criteria, with another 50 points that were allocated or distributed by the Northeast. This includes things like increasing the number of points available to an existing credit or the development of new credits specific for the Northeast. And I had mentioned that new renovation projects are also eligible for CHPS recognition. but at reduced points. And you can see here that for new construction, it's 110 points out of 250, whereas major renovations, it's only 85 minimum are required. And we also limit the prerequisites by the scope of the project. So a little detail as to what's new in the different credit categories. In the integration category, there's a new prerequisite for crime prevention through environmental design, and then new credits for enhanced integration design, district sustainability plans, educational integration. We think that's very important, integrating the high performance design concepts into the curriculum, and that can be done in a number of ways. And then finally, we have the high performance transition plan, and this is a way for phased renovation projects to ultimately receive the CHPS recognition, CHPS verified. In the operations and metrics, integrated test management is now a prerequisite, and as our performance benchmarking for energy is required. And the environmental management plan is now a prerequisite. So again, we're designing for this high-performing indoor environment, and we want to make sure that we maintain that. And then there are also credits for post-occupancy transition and high-performance operations. Again, it's to ensure the performance that we've designed for. In IEQ, there are no new prerequisites, but there are a number of credit updates and new credits. The required MERV rating has been raised. There is now an alternative to flush out. It's similar to the LEED v4 option. There's more details on construction moisture management. Again, I don't know if in the news there's been a lot of issues with schools having mold problems, so we're trying to help with the design there. We've introduced low radon credit as well as low EMF best practices and improved acoustics. I mentioned in energy that we have designed towards ZNE, and so one of the things that we've done there is we've incorporated the ZEPI scale, which is the Zero Energy Performance Index. And what it does, it provides a constant scale. So it's an absolute scale as opposed to a relative one. So as the codes change, they get placed on the scale. So it makes it easier to follow along. It's also makes it easier to track the design changes, things like it accounts for renewable plug load reductions, daylighting and natural ventilation, more efficient windows and lightings. So in the CHPS criteria now, you can use the ZEPI scale as an option to determine how many points in it as opposed to percent beyond code. And then so in some other items in energy, there's a new prerequisite for the CFC band, environmentally preferable refrigerant, and there are new credits related to envelope conditioning, energy monitoring, and electric vehicle charging, among some of them. Just to note, questions are coming in now. We're going to wait till the end to answer them. Okay, so but keep writing in your questions so that they will be addressed towards the end, at the end of the session. In water, just a few changes. We've updated the water fixture requirements to now match the EPA water sense. There's a new credit for rainwater collection and storage. Let's see, in sites, There's an option now for site selection based on the US EPA siting guidelines. And we looked at new novel forms of human-powered transportation, things like skis, which you wouldn't necessarily have out here in California or Texas or some of the other states where there are CHPS criteria. So that is unique to the Northeast. There is a new prerequisite for site and building best practices, and also looking at new credits related to locally native plants and construction site runoff control. In the materials and waste management category, the construction site waste management requirement has been increased, and we've also introduced new credits for environmental product declarations and health product declarations, consistent with, in a similar manner to LEED. However, we still do have the individual attribute credits as well for things like recycled content and regional materials. That has not changed. Okay, so that's very high level on the credits. If you have any questions, please ask. I'm going to transition now to some of the changes in the processes between the former Massachusetts CHPS and the current Northeast CHPS. We've designed this to try and simplify and increase the transparency of documentation. So all the documentation requirements are now included in the criteria. In the past, the documentation requirements in many cases were only listed in the workbook, the required workbook to be completed. Now those documentation requirements are in the criteria. And in addition, there's a standalone document that just lists out the requirements, the documentation requirements for all of the credits and prerequisites. We've also moved to a plan and spec approach where we're relying much more heavily on referencing your existing construction documents, the specs, and construction drawings. We do have a couple of additional tools, which is the scorecard workbook, and as I mentioned, the documentation summary, which just details for each credit the documentation required without going into all the details of the credit itself. So I've mentioned the scorecard workbook. So this new scorecard workbook includes 2 full-size plan sheets, and the idea is to enable team-wide compliance. The 2 worksheets are an annotated scorecard, which is shown down below here, and then a materials worksheet, a way to track all the materials. As we mentioned, we reference CDs wherever possible. We're trying to minimize the amount of additional documentation that's required. There are a few additional documents. There are some resolutions and reports, and there are a couple of spreadsheets that need to be filled out. So that's at the high level, and we're going to use this as the point to transition over to the perspective of our architect who's been working on the first Northeast CHPS project, Mr. James Carr, and his associate, Lisa Purdy. So if you give me a moment here, I'm going to unshare the screen. I'm going to hand the screen over. So 1 minute. All right, that does not seem to be working. All right, James, I am going to unmute you. And Lisa, if you can just go ahead and tell me when to advance the screens. Unfortunately, I am not able to hand it over to you directly. So James, whenever you're ready.
Oh, okay. All right. I guess we're unmuted now.
You are.
I'm hoping that people can hear us, I guess. And let me see now. I am not seeing the shared screen.
Oh, I have to share the screen again. Is it there again?
Okay. All right. So welcome everybody, and thanks for being here, virtually speaking. It would be nice to see everybody, but I guess that's not the way this works. So just as by way of introduction, so Stephanie did a great job of staying on our schedule. So we're going to try to keep our part of the presentation to 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So it's myself and then Lisa Purdy, who's with me here.
Hello there.
And so by way of a little bit of history, I was first involved with CHPS in 2003 when CHPS was a California-based system, and Massachusetts was looking for an alternative to LEED, which at that point didn't even have a school-specific, or maybe it was just rolling out a school-specific program. And California had developed this Coalition for High Performance Schools program with the Best Practices Manual. And I worked on a group with a group of other architects and engineers to adapt that system, the Best Practices Manual, to Massachusetts. And that was done over a period of about a year and became the Best Practices Manual in 2004. One other note, Stephanie introduced us as the project architect for the new school, the first Northeast CHPS school. That's not actually the case. The project architect is Turowski II Architects, and we are the sustainability consultant on that project. So we are the CHPS consultant managing the CHPS process. We're also architects, but we also do this type of consulting. And just to make a general point, by way of overview, one thing when we start talking about the documentation requirements for CHPS or for LEED, and we get into the process, people are often a little, how do you say, like bewildered or overwhelmed by the amount of documentation required. And sometimes I guess people feel that it's a distraction from the actual work of making a sustainable or green building. So what we like to point out as part of that process, and we've been doing this for a long time, is when people feel that way, we like to point out that CHPS and LEED, to state the obvious, that what they are is third-party verification systems. And so as much as they're about designing and building green buildings, as much as they're about sustainability and energy efficiency, recycled content of products, and all the rest of the things we're trying to achieve, they are just as much about information and gathering and organizing information in a clear way about a project so that at the end of the day, the project can be verified by a third party who's not involved with the design, not involved with the construction, and is also typically at a distance, sometimes in the case of CHPS at a fairly large distance, all the way in California. In the case of LEED, it's actually global. They have verifiers all over the world. So the idea being that by putting together all this information in a coherent way and uploading it or sending it on to reviewers, such as the reviewers at CHPS and LEED, they can understand enough about the project relative to the criteria that they've set forth that they can then verify that, yes, indeed, this project meets the criteria and is a green building. And the good news about that, in our experience, is that by having to document and verify the project, at the end of the day, we've seen how this really works to ensure that all the good intentions that people start out with actually get followed through on and become real in the building. Whereas when we were working on green buildings before CHPS and LEED, it was often the case, sort of unfortunately often the case, that people would start out with good intentions about what they wanted to achieve, and then through all the back and forth and complications of getting a building built, many of those intentions were left by the wayside, and then there was no way to really know what had happened relative to the intentions. And so more often than not, the intentions were touted as the achievement when in fact they hadn't in many cases been achieved. So that's kind of background, and now we get into how this actually plays out in reality. How does the rubber meet the road, so to speak? So the old system of mass chips was fairly cumbersome. It was documented through a large interconnected Excel form that would then have to be turned into a PDF. And every single credit, so there are 100+ credits, had its own form, as you see on the left, and then there are 3 pages to that form with the blue and brown bars. And then all of that information was sort of check boxes or fill in the blanks. And then there was backup documentation that was uploaded, as you see on the right, either letters, resolutions, site plans, documents, parts of the CDs, excerpts, etc. All that had to be gathered together, turned into a PDF, and at the end of the day, the PDF, as you can see there, our little screenshot was, in this project in particular, was over 1,500 pages long, and that was just the design submittal. Then there was another construction submittal that was just as long. So, so it was a fair bit of work to put all that together. And CHPS, as Stephanie said, has tried to streamline the approach. So next slide, Stephanie.
So the new system, which you saw a piece of during Stephanie's presentation, starts with this annotated scorecard. And so at the bottom you can see that, so the scorecard is based on an Excel format, and we've uploaded it to Google Drive, which we'll discuss later. But so this is the annotated scorecard, which you can see zoomed in, has the list of the credits as well as what we're pursuing. And this cover sheet it's full size, so it can be included in the CDs, or it can just be used as an internal reference. And the tabs along the bottom, II design, II construction, that's innovation and integration. That's where you have the documentation summaries for each credit, and so that's where you add the references to the specs and the drawings.
Yes, so rather than having every individual credit having its own tab, in this case it's done by category. And so you're basically filling in the cells and writing notes to the reviewers as to where to find the information they need to find in the spec and the drawings, which makes it simpler for the design team. So next slide. Stephanie, next slide. Oh, there we go. Whoops.
Oh. Go back one.
There we go. Okay, so also part of the new system. So there are some forms that are still to be filled out within the Excel. Within that Excel document, there's a handful of forms, and that's when there are internal calculations that are necessary to achieve the credit. CHPS has provided those as built-in forms with the calculations built in. So I guess we'll skip to the next slide. So we're going a little over already, so let's go to the next slide. Whoops, back one.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the user and CHPS communication. So we found CHPS to be really responsive, so we use Basecamp as a way to, so on Basecamp it's just a sort of file sharing communication platform for project team members. So we also have the architects are shared on all of these conversations, and so as you can see here, we use this as a way to get small clarifications on certain little language items in the credits, so irrigation systems, construction site waste management, high intensity fluorescence, and how are we going to track construction waste. We just have lots of, we find that questions have come up, and CHPS has been really efficient about getting back to us on those, and Basecamp is a way to have those all recorded in one place and have everyone have access, everyone that needs access, architects and contractors and consultants can see these as well.
And I would say this is a difference between CHPS and LEAD, is that anyone who's worked with LEAD knows that the system for questions and answers is extremely formal. You have to submit it through online processes that are formal requests, and the only types of questions you can get quick answers on are sort of protocol questions about using LEAD Online as opposed to technical questions about the credits themselves. Whereas with CHPS, they're quite good about small interpretations of the credit technical issues. Next slide.
There's also an option for the more formal criteria clarifications, as James was talking about. So that's the CHPS criteria interpretation, the CCI. So each project, each verified project, receives 3 sort of CCIs that go along with registration. And this is a more formal way of recording it, and then it's also recorded online in the CCI library. So in addition to Basecamp for smaller questions, for really important clarifications, such as needing to find an alternate route of compliance to a prerequisite, we would use the CCI. And this is just useful for when, questions do come up when generalized credit criteria meet these real-world building situations.
Yeah. So next slide. So now we're going to jump into some of the additional responsibilities within CHPS that are a little bit quite distinct from LEED. So LEED does not really have an operations and maintenance section within the LEED for new construction or LEED for schools systems. So they have packaged operations and maintenance into a separate system called LEED Existing Buildings Operations and Maintenance, which is its own LEED system, and you have to go through a whole process to get LEED certified under that system. With CHPS, they've folded those, and this goes back to the beginning of CHPS, that operations and maintenance were always part of the CHPS system, and so we've always felt that is something that actually elevates CHPS in terms of sustainability a little bit above the LEED system, because in reality what really matters most is how buildings are operated and maintained when you really look at sustainability over the long term. And whereas the design can be very high performance, if it isn't maintained and operated in a high performance way, all that can kind of go out the window, literally speaking, I guess. Now, with CHPS, you have the school district responsibilities, and some of those are prerequisites. And actually, this is a point that I just wanted to mention for people who are unfamiliar with these systems. Both LEED and CHPS have things called prerequisites, and then they have things called credits, which in CHPS, both prerequisites and credits carry points. In LEED, it's only the credits that carry the points. But the main issue to understand about prerequisites is that all prerequisites are required for every project that is getting verified by CHPS or certified by LEED. And you can't skip one, you can't miss one, you have to do all of them. And so that's important to understand, especially for school districts who are entertaining doing CHPS projects, is that they have to incorporate all of these operations and maintenance and sometimes policies into their project and into their ongoing operations. So let's skip ahead. We can come back to the specifics later, but let's skip to the next thing. So these are some of the optional credits that school districts can undertake to do. And again, I don't think we have time to hit on every one. We could come back to it later. But I'll hold the slide there for a minute. Actually, can you hold the slide a minute so that, can you go back? So just people have a chance to look at it. One point I would like to make is that sometimes for these types of school district responsibility credits, there are some credits which, you shouldn't be shy of looking at them, because in some cases you may be already doing them. So for instance, OM 7.1 green cleaning. Now, many schools in Massachusetts, many public agencies are already doing green cleaning as part of their operations. And if so, which is probably typical these days, you're already using green cleaning products, you're already using green cleaning practices. It would just be a matter of aligning, making sure that the policies and procedures you're using already align with the CHPS requirements, which most likely they do for 90%. You could tweak the other 10%. And then probably having a resolution signed at the school district level if you haven't already. And then you would get those points for something you're already doing. And then in addition, another good example similar to that is the green power requirement. So this relates to purchasing so-called green power from the utilities, where they are basically subsidizing renewable energy as part of the power package that you buy. Many municipalities are already buying green power for their municipal buildings, and so this is simply a matter of documenting that in order to get those credits. So same with computerized maintenance. Many schools are moving to, like, many school districts are moving to, like School Dude, one of those types of maintenance programs. Again, so these shouldn't be things that you shy away from if you're a school district. You may be already doing them. Next slide. So we have 5 minutes before the Q&A time, but we'll try to go through them quickly. Lisa already mentioned the Google Drive. This was, one big question that came up was if you have a document like that Google spreadsheet, like that Excel spreadsheet, how do you manage that among a complicated team involving engineers, architects, contractors, building owners, and managers? You certainly don't want to get into a situation of having to email a document around and keep track of multiple versions. So what we actually ended up doing was putting the document on Google Drive and then sharing it. And we find that Google has many useful tools for keeping track of changes, and they do it, auto saves every 5 seconds. So it's really hard to lose data. It's really hard to for somebody to mess up the file. You can always return back to a previous version. And then as additional fail-safes, we control who has access pretty closely. And we also make periodic saves onto our own server so that we have a copy of milestones and intermediate milestones. Next slide. So now another challenge with CHPS, because again it was developed in California and it's meant for a national market. And Massachusetts, as anyone who's worked in the public construction field in Massachusetts knows, has a somewhat particular and complex public bidding process. There are things that only exist in a few states, like this filed sub-bid system. Other things that exist in many states, such as the 3 equals rule for products. And then typically in Massachusetts, although this is changing somewhat, typically we use a design bid build process so that contractors are not involved until after the design is complete. This was a case where we found that the CHPS criteria was written to require contractors to be on board with the design team by design development before the start of construction documents and be participating in an integrative way with the design. Well, unless you have construction management at risk as your delivery system, that doesn't work in Massachusetts. So this was a case where we went back to CHPS and we said, look, this really doesn't work with Massachusetts, it doesn't work with the design bid build process, and they worked with us and we did a formal CCI, and the resolution was that as long as the contractor are on board right away after the contract is awarded, that would be all right. And so the next slide talks about that a little.
Thanks.
So the agreement was with CHPS that as long as we had a contractor kickoff meeting that was like another design charrette involving participation from design and engineering team, school district facilities managers, school staff occupants, commissioning agent, contractor, and key subcontractors. And we went through the CHPS criteria. We went through the EBMC form, the Basecamp, and the Google Drive. We could work, and then that way we would meet the criteria for CHPS for that credit prerequisite. Next slide. Another big issue is the 3 equal rule, and how do you handle specifying a project with multiple products required for every type of product. How do you meet certain criteria for products, such as the percentage of recycled content? This is something that we've dealt with for a long time in Massachusetts. We had this came up a few years back, and we developed a new, different way of doing this. Rather than requiring the architects to specify 3 products that all had a certain minimum level of recycled content, which is really an extra lot of work and sometimes impossible. What we did is we suggested to the Attorney General's office that this could be a requirement of the project in the specs, that 20%, say, of the project materials would be recycled content in the aggregate, which is the way that CHPS and LEED credits are written. And in order to achieve that, the contractor would be able to use the next slide, we'll show. So we developed a submittal form, and basically this is where the contractor can then harvest information on pretty much every project in the every product in the project. They can harvest the information about how much post-consumer, how much post-industrial, how much rapidly renewable, how much forest stewardship certified wood is in every product in the building. And as they get these submittals from all the subcontractors, they tally it all up, and as long as they meet the overall threshold for the project, then the credits can be achieved. And that's the system we use, and it works with the New England CHPS as well. Next slide. Another challenge we had was, do you want to take this one?
Sure. We found, so there's a separate demolition contract separate from the building construction contract, and so we were struggling with how we would maintain accountability for the demolition contractor, that they would be responsible in part for the waste management credit, since the construction review wouldn't be happening until potentially years after the demolition contract was over. So our solution for that, next slide, was to, well, CHPS gave us access to this very useful spreadsheet just so that we could do an informal early review using this spreadsheet to estimate the diversion rate as we went along. So we requested to have the waste slips from the demolition contractor forwarded to us, and then we would review that and the letters included along with the waste slips. We would review the letters from the waste facility to check their diversion rate and how much waste was produced, so we could keep a running list of whether or not the demolition contractor was meeting our waste diversion goal. So this is just an example here, but sort of illustrates the point. And so if there was a problem, we could sort of meet it real time.
Yeah, I think the goal here is that we were trying to make sure that we had an early verification of the documentation from the demolition contractor, and in their spec we require them to be responsive in case, in the event that their documentation wasn't suitable for submittal to CHPS at the end of the project. And then that documentation from the demolition contractor gets routed to the building construction contractor, who then tallies it up with the rest of their waste management. So it was a little bit of extra work to do that, but working with CHPS closely was a good example of how we were able to work with CHPS closely to figure out a way to get it done. Next slide. This is a design thing. We're running out of time, so let's just mention that CHPS, this is sort of a joke image, but that CHPS does require this crime prevention through environmental design prerequisite, and so this is a good example of how using these systems requires sometimes new levels of collaboration between, in this case, the school district, the architect, the landscape architect, and the security consultant, to balance the competing needs of clear sight lines for security cameras and landscaping with trees. And in this case, the landscape architect made sure to specify trees with high canopies. Next slide. We also probably don't have time to talk much about this, but daylighting through CHPS does allow daylighting modeling to be done with a heliodon, which is a type of physical model that is used in the daylight to get a very realistic, measurable, quantifiable daylight levels. They also allow computational models or any combination thereof. Next slide. So another design feature of this particular school by Tarowski Architects and their landscape architect Dodson Flinker is a really integrated educational design with outdoor gardens and a roof garden that has educational features and a rain garden that collects water off the roof and then uses that in a rain garden along with the play structures to create a really dynamic learning environment. And that's all integrated with signage and very closely connected to CHPS's credit requirements relative to educational integration, which they go into quite a bit of depth about. I think that's our last slide. So maybe we have some way to do questions. I don't know how we can do questions.
I think, yeah.
We have 4 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you, James.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do have there's a place within the GoToWebinar control panel for sending in questions, and if you can also raise your hand, and then that's another way we can see if there's a question that we can answer. We did have a question come in related to the update to the IECC 2015, which goes into effect in January 1st of 2017 in Massachusetts. And the question was, will CHPS be updated for this change? And the answer is yes. Given the way the criteria is structured, CHPS will work closely with the MSBA to make sure that the Massachusetts addendum is addressed such that it meets the requirements of the MSBA. So we will update it in conjunction with MSBA to confirm that the changes meet the requirements, but it does not require a whole-scale update. Because we use the ZEPI scale, it should simplify it a little bit, just essentially changing the required ZEPU score to meet with the MSBA requirements. However, it will be updated, and that will be released and go into effect in time for the January 1st effective date in Massachusetts. Let's see. A